Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 19, Minimum Wage Laws. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing this series as a parallel series with with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to that so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of particularly this read, Hazlitt has broken up this chapter into three sections that are labeled entirely numerically. And since there is no label for the first section, I'll have to insert that after I read the chapter's title. So without further ado, let's dive into tonight's read, which is Chapter 19, Minimum Wage Laws, Part 1. We have already seen some of the harmful results of arbitrary governmental efforts to raise the price of favored commodities. The same sort of harmful results follow efforts to raise wages through minimum wage laws. This ought not to be surprising, for a wage is, in fact, a price. It is unfortunate for clarity of economic thinking that the price of labor services should have received an entirely different name from other prices. This has prevented most people from recognizing that the same principles govern both. Thinking has become so emotional and so politically biased on the subject of wages that in most discussions of them, the plainest principles are ignored. People who would be among the first to deny that prosperity could be brought about by artificially boosting prices, people who would be among the first to point out that minimum price laws might be most harmful to the very industries they are designed to help, will nevertheless advocate minimum wage laws and denounce opponents of them without misgivings. Yet it ought to be clear that a minimum wage law is, at best, a limited weapon for combating the evil of low wages, and that the possible good to be achieved by such a law can exceed the possible harm only in proportion as its aims are modest. The more ambitious such a law is, the larger number of workers it attempts to cover, and the more it attempts to raise their wages, the more certain are its harmful effects to exceed any possible good effects. The first thing that happens, for example, when a law is passed that no one shall be paid less than $106 for a 40-hour week, is that no one who is not worth $106 a week to an employer will be employed at all. You cannot make a man worth a given amount by making it illegal for anyone to offer him anything less. You merely deprive him of the right to earn the amount that his abilities and situation would permit him to earn, while you deprive the community even of the moderate services that he is capable of rendering. In brief, for a low wage, you substitute unemployment. You do harm all around with no comparable compensation. The only exception to this occurs when a group of workers is receiving a wage actually below its market worth. This is likely to happen only in rare and special circumstances, or localities where competitive forces do not operate freely or adequately. But nearly all these special cases could be remedied just as effectively, more flexibly, and with far less potential harm by unionization. It may be thought that if the law forces the payment of a higher wage in a given industry, that industry can then charge higher prices for its product, so that the burden of paying the higher wage is merely shifted to consumers. Such shifts, however, are not easily made, nor are the consequences of artificial wage raising so easily escaped. A higher price for the product may not be possible. It may merely drive consumers to the equivalent imported products or to some substitute. Or, if consumers continue to buy the product of the industry in which wages have been raised, the higher price will cause them to buy less of it. While some workers in the industry may be benefited from the higher wage, therefore, others will be thrown out of employment altogether. On the other hand, if the price of the product is not raised, marginal producers in the industry will be driven out of business, so that reduced production and consequent unemployment will merely be brought about in another way. When such consequences are pointed out, there are those who apply, quote, Very well, if it is true that the X industry cannot exist except by paying starvation wages, then it will be just as well if the minimum wage puts it out of existence altogether. End quote. But this brave pronouncement overlooks the realities. It overlooks, first of all, that consumers will suffer the loss of that product. It forgets, in the second place, that it is merely condemning the people who worked in that industry to unemployment. It ignores, finally, that bad as were the wages paid in the X industry, they were the best among all the alternatives that seemed open to the workers in that industry. Otherwise, the workers would have gone into another. If, therefore, the X industry is driven out of existence by the minimum wage law, then the workers previously employed in that industry will be forced to turn to alternative courses that seemed less attractive to them in the first place. Their competition for jobs will drive down the pay offered even in these alternative occupations. There is no escape from the conclusion that the minimum wage will increase unemployment. Part 2. A nice problem, moreover, will be raised by the relief program designed to take care of the unemployment caused by the minimum wage law. By a minimum wage of, say, $2.65 an hour, we have forbidden anyone to work 40 hours a week for less than $106. Suppose now we offer only $70 a week on relief. This means that we have forbidden a man to be usefully employed at, say, $90 a week in order that we may support him at $70 a week in idleness. We have deprived society of the value of his services. We have deprived the man of the independence and self-respect that come from self-support, even at a low level, and from performing wanted work at the same time as we have lowered what the man could have received by his own efforts. These consequences follow as long as the weekly relief payment is a penny less than $106. Yet the higher we make the relief payment, the worse we make the situation in other respects. If we offer $106 for relief, then we offer many men just as much for not working as for working. Moreover, whatever the sum we offer for relief, we create a situation in which everyone is working only for the difference between his wages and the amount of the relief. If the relief is $106 a week, for example, workers offered a wage of $2.75 an hour, or $110 a week, are in fact, as they see it, being asked to work for only $4 a week, for they can get the rest without doing anything. It may be thought that we can escape these consequences by offering quote-unquote work relief instead of quote-unquote home relief, but we merely change the nature of the consequences. Work relief means that we are paying the beneficiaries more than the open market would pay them for their efforts. Only part of their relief wage is for their efforts, therefore, while the rest is a disguised dole. It remains to be pointed out that government make-work is necessarily inefficient and of questionable utility. The government has to invent projects that will employ the least skilled. It cannot start teaching people carpentry, masonry, and the like for fear of competing with established skills and arousing the antagonism of existing unions. I am not recommending it, but it probably would be less harmful all around if the government in the first place frankly subsidized the wages of submarginal workers at the work they were already doing. Yet this would create political headaches of its own. We need not pursue this point further, as it would carry us into problems not immediately relevant. But the difficulties and consequences of relief must be kept in mind when we consider the adoption of minimum wage laws or an increase in minimums already fixed. Before we finish the topic, I should perhaps mention another argument sometimes put forward for fixing a minimum wage by statute. This is that an industry in which one big company enjoys a monopoly, it need not fear competition and can offer below-market wages. This is a highly improbable situation. Such a quote-unquote monopoly company must offer high wages when it is formed in order to attract labor from other industries. Thereafter, it could theoretically fail to increase wage rates as much as other industries and so pay quote-unquote substandard wages for that particular specialized skill. But this would be likely to happen only if that industry or company was sick or shrinking. If it were prosperous or expanding, it would have to continue to offer high wages to increase its labor force. We know as a matter of experience that it is the big companies, those most often accused of being monopolies, that pay the highest wages and offer the most attractive working conditions. It is commonly the small marginal firms, perhaps suffering from excessive competition, that offer the lowest wages. But all employers must pay enough to hold workers or to attract them from each other. Part 3. All this is not to argue that there is no way of raising wages. It is merely to point out that the apparently easy method of raising them by government fiat is the wrong way and the worst way. This is perhaps as good a place as any to point out that what distinguishes many reformers from those who cannot accept their proposals is not their greater philanthropy, but their greater impatience. The question is not whether we wish to see everybody as well off as possible. Among men of goodwill, such an aim can be taken for granted. The real question concerns the proper means of achieving it. And in trying to answer this, we must never lose sight of a few elementary truisms. We cannot distribute more wealth than is created. We cannot, in the long run, pay labor as a whole more than it produces. The best way to raise wages, therefore, is to raise marginal labor productivity. This can be done by many methods. By an increase in capital accumulation, i.e., by an increase in the machines with which the workers are aided, by new inventions and improvements, by more efficient management on the part of employers, by more industriousness and efficiency on the part of workers, by better education and training. The more the individual worker produces, the more he increases the wealth of the whole community. The more he produces, the more his services are worth to consumers and hence to his employers. And the more he is worth to employers, the more he will be paid. Real wages come out of production, not out of government decrees. So government policy should be directed not to imposing more burdensome requirements on employers, but to following policies that encourage profits, that encourage employers to expand, to invest in newer and better machines to increase the productivity of workers. In brief, to encourage capital accumulation instead of discouraging it, and to increase both employment and wage rates. That concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this may be, in my opinion, the best chapter in the book and one of the best reads that he puts together in all of his writings here with Henry Hazlitt in Chapter 19, the minimum wage laws. In fact, the chapter is called Minimum Wage Laws, and because of its presentation, it could simply be labeled, if it were released today as a YouTube video, Hazlitt Destroys Minimum Wage. And again, it's not only a well-written chapter, it's just also that it's just nonstop hot takes, and he's spitting all of this fire, again, in 1946. So remember remember throughout the course of this read that this book, for the purposes of context, was initially written in 1946, and that Hazlitt died like 40 years ago. I may actually be off. He might have been even longer than that, because 40 years ago to 1981. But anyways, the short version of this is that it kind of I've kind of already gone over this in another video. I'll put a link to that in this video's description. It was my series. It's in my other channel. It was a video I did on the law of demand and how minimum wage laws create unemployment. So that video goes into much greater detail as to how that's the case and how you can derive that from just the basics of the laws of supply and demand. But the two big takeaways to get from this entire chapter are the two lessons that he's basically been going over throughout the course of at least the last few chapters here. Wages are nothing more than prices. And two, money represents productivity. Money is nothing more than a medium of exchange, and the money that can be exchanged for a certain amount of labor will always be representative of that labor, which means if you flood the market with the supply of money, then the amount of productivity is going to remain unchanged. So in order for you to have a certain percentage of that medium of exchange represent that labor, you're going to have the normative amount, the flat amount change. You're going to have to see that go up. And that's true of all things. When you establish a price floor, you wind up decreasing the quantity of demand. And that's because when you increase the price of a good or service, you decrease the quantity demanded. And this is, again, something we learned from like Econ Day 1. And we could honestly just end the chapter there, but as Henry Hazlitt explains on page 134, thinking has become so emotional and so politically biased on the subject of wages that in most discussions of them, the plainest principles are ignored. Sound familiar, folks? Here in 1921, 65 years later? So all of the lessons that are in this chapter stem from that basic lesson in Intro to Econ Day 1. You increase the minimum wage, you decrease employment. And that's because the quantity of demand in the labor market is going to decline as the price of labor, which is all a wage is a price, goes up. So remember, this is just a lesson that we just went over and we were able to suss out in 30 seconds. Again, from the law of demand. And the response from the left, of course, is I'm sure you've all heard, is studies show this isn't the case. Well, these are actually the laws of supply and demand. These are laws in the same way that the laws of thermodynamics are laws of thermodynamics. You can't change them. When a study shows that a minimum wage law didn't decrease employment or didn't cause unemployment, either they've missed the point or something else is at play. So either it actually has and their data shows it and they're missing it, or they've either done poor independent variable control or something else is just simply at play. And we know this is true because in the same way that we know all bachelors are unmarried, right? We don't need a study to show us how many bachelors that were polled turned out to be unmarried. It's how we define the word bachelor. A bachelor is defined by the fact that the person is unmarried. So if I say to you, how many bachelors are unmarried, and you say none, and I say, well, show me the study that shows that has an N of 10,000 people, or 100,000 bachelors that polled them to see how many of them are unmarried. You don't need to do that. In this case, what we have is a difference between proof and evidence. And in this case, when you have something that can be logically derived from a law, then you don't really need evidence to prove that the thing is true. Because again, we're logically deriving this from law. And then this is something I went over in another video. I'll put a link in this video's description to the video where I went into much greater detail on the difference between proof and evidence. So whenever somebody brings up the study show this isn't the case, remember those three edicts. Something else is at play. We know this is true in the same way that we know that all bachelors are unmarried is true. And all of this is something we can derive from the difference between proof and evidence. So the first claim here, the first reason that minimum wage laws are bad is that they create unemployment. And Henry Hazlitt goes over this in great detail in the first section here. The money you pay will always represent their productivity. And this is, again, from how we define money as a medium of exchange. And we just went over how that gets to a logical position where anytime you have an increase in minimum wage, anytime you increase the price floor, anytime you in effect increase the sum of all prices, then what you're going to see is a decrease in demand because the money you pay them will always represent their productivity. Hazlitt points this out on page 135. You cannot, this is on page 135. Page 135. You cannot make a man worth a given amount by making it illegal for anyone to offer him anything less. Excuse me. And this stems from what he says in the previous sentence. The first thing that happens under minimum wage when a law is passed that no one shall be paid less than $106 for a 40-hour week is that no one who is worth $106 a week to an employer will be employed at all. At least legally, that's true. And I'm sure that the person who is making $105 a week would prefer that $105 a week to $0 a week. So that's the first step, the first thing, the most obvious thing to point out about minimum wage laws and why they are bad. But worse, by paying people not to work, okay, so another response to if these people aren't working, well, we just have the government put them on the government dole. But by paying people not to work, you incentivize them not to work. And this, again, is something we don't need evidence of. We don't need to say, well, did they not work? Obviously, an incentive to do a thing doesn't require that you do the thing in order for it to be an incentive. If I have offered to pay you to be in the world of landscaping rather than be unemployed, then that money that I'm offering you is an incentive to do the thing. Whether or not you act on that incentive doesn't negate the fact that the incentive is there. And I'll have to do a video in my series on my other channel. I'll have to do a video in my series on philosophical concepts to go over what the word incentive means and how you don't need to see people act on an incentive for the incentive to be there. Again, this is something that comes from the difference between proof versus evidence, which I will link in this video's description, that conversation, which I did in another video. Beyond going one step beyond the fact that you have incentivized people not to work, if you're paying them not to work, you're also disincentivizing them working at a certain wage rate, and that's because of a concept called marginal disutility. This read is meant to be an introductory read when it comes to econ, so I'm not going to go into a great detail into what marginal disutility is, but this is what Henry Hazlitt is talking about on page 135 when he says that, if you're being paid if the minimum wage is $106 a week, but you can make $105 to stay home, why on earth would you go work when you can take $1 off of how much you would go work for an entire week and just stay home, right? Like if we were to put that into today's numbers, if you're paid $20 an hour, let's say the minimum wage was $20 an hour, 40 hours a week, that's $800. If you're paid $700 a week to stay home and do nothing, then you're really only gaining $100 a week to go from 0 hours a week worked to 40 hours a week work. So that's the marginal disutility, is that difference. And is it really worth it for what works out to basically $2.50 an hour more than what you would just be making to sit at home and do nothing? And by the way, does this sound familiar? Could this possibly be a more timely lesson in June 2021 of how if you pay people not to work, they won't work. Even if you're paying them less than what they would make to work, it may not be enough more to go back to work than to not go back to work. And that's especially true if you're paying people more to not work than to go to work. Obviously, there are rationales in certain cases for going to work that extend beyond the dollar. But for the overwhelming majority of people, if you're paying people more to not work at all than to have to work 40 hours a week, who on earth is going back to work? One of the other things that Hazlitt points out is that, and one of the things that we know from the arguments from the left, why do big companies, these big evil corporate giants, if you will, support minimum wage? Well, it's because they can afford to cover that cost. This is what Henry Hazlitt's talking about on page 138. When he doesn't actually name any companies, but I mean the lesson is true today, as true in 1946 as it is today. When you have companies like Amazon and Home Depot, Amazon already has a minimum wage in its company of $15 an hour. Even if you're working in Idaho, even if you're working in a place where the state's minimum wage is less than half of that, Amazon will not pay its workers less than $15 an hour. And the same thing is true of Home Depot. You could go work at my family's local hardware store. You can work for them. They're going to pay you barely more than a minimum wage. Or you can go to Home Depot, where Home Depot will pay you quite a bit more than that. And the reason that they can do that is Henry Hazlitt explains, is because if they're growing, then obviously they have to attract more labor than they already have, which means that obviously their pay rate, the rationale to work for them, the incentive to go work for them versus the local hardware store has to be greater, or they won't be able to grow, or they won't be able to attract those employers, those new employees. The other thing is that by having that huge capital backing, if you raise the minimum wage, by having that huge capital backing that places like Home Depot and Amazon have, they can afford to more easily, quote, weather the storm until all the mom and pop shops are out of town, until all of the fringe shops, all of the companies that are what, as Henry Hazlitt describes them, as in the margins, go out of business because they can't afford to weather that storm by paying their employers, the employees, more than what they were making before, more than their productivity, their productivity is valued at the market rate. Once that competition goes out of business, they can afford to jack up their prices and make back those losses because they have that capital backing to afford to weather the storm. And Henry Hazlitt points this out on page 135. Well, it starts on page 135. On the other hand, if the price of the product is not raised, so we talked about the situation where the price isn't raised, marginal producers, those are those fringe producers in the industry, will be driven out of business. And this is true. And this basically is putting all of those people that were working for those businesses out of business anyways. And even if it's only temporary, and Home Depot absorbs those employees, well, they would prefer to actually work for less, to work for the mom and pop shop, as evidenced by the fact that they were already working for the mom and pop shop and for less. It may even be that their value of their labor is not worth what Home Depot is going to have to pay them to work for them. And I'll give the perfect example of this is something I experienced in landscaping, where we had handicapped people working for us, and the state allowed them to work for less than minimum wage because they were handicapped. Now, in this case, part of that was because they were on the government dole to a certain extent, but there was work that we needed to have them do. For example, picking up sticks, pulling weeds, things that really anyone can do, things that a high schooler could do if high schoolers were allowed to go out and work these jobs for a rate that isn't $15 an hour. I'm sorry, but I can't afford, as I do some landscaping on the side for myself, I can't afford to employ a high schooler at $15 an hour. At $15 an hour, I have got to have somebody who has experience in that field. And that hurts the high schooler in the short and long term, and severely, because they come out of high school with no money from that job that they could have had, and more importantly, no experience. And maybe they don't want to be landscapers for the rest of their lives. But the fact that they had a time card, the fact that they have me as a reference to say, yeah, this guy showed up every day, never called in sick, did what I asked him to do, was on time. I mean, employers love having that work ethic. And work ethic is something that's extremely difficult to weed out during the hiring process by any means other than going to these references and asking them, do we have to worry about this guy's work ethic? And of course, the response from the left is something that we've all heard today, about these companies on the fringe going out of business. We've all heard the response from the left, and Hazlitt points this out, he points this out on page 136, again, in 1946. And this is all in scare quotes. Very well, if it is true that the X industry cannot exist except by paying starvation wages, then it will be just as well if the minimum wage puts it out of existence altogether. I'm sure we've all heard this before. Does this sound familiar? The response, of course, is obviously this is the preferred employment. Obviously, these people that were working at those places would prefer to be working there than somewhere else because they were working there and not somewhere else. And obviously, they would prefer to have that money because they have that money. And obviously, the employer would prefer to employ them because they were employing them. And it may be that the only reason that they were employed was because that's all they were worth, was that dollar amount. And that fringe company, that's all they can afford to hire them for. When in the world of landscaping, the reason it's so helpful to have these people we can pay next to nothing for to do things like pull weeds and pick up sticks is because these are jobs that need to be done. And if we have to pay somebody to pick weeds, then that person better be only capable of picking weeds. Because if they're also capable of pruning shrubs, that's a much higher paid job. That's a much more skilled labor. That's a much more difficult task to learn, and there's a learning curve, and there's a work ethic that has to come with that you have to commit to in order to be good at it, and it's exhausting. So, like, if you've got the guy that you're paying $18 an hour to be the guy who prunes the actual weeds, and then you've got a guy following behind him prunes the bushes, who's cleaning up that debris. I mean, that could be really anyone. That could be some 16-year-old who's never been employed doing anything before in their entire lives. They're not using dangerous equipment. It's incredibly easy. It's unbelievably, there's no learning curve whatsoever, and it needs to be done. So either you're going to wind up paying the guy who's making $18 an hour to actually prune the bushes, or you're paying some high school kid $15 an hour. And if you lose that high school kid, now the guy that's pruning those bushes, after he's done pruning the bushes, has to go back and pick up all that debris. The reason that's a bad thing is because if you've got one job that takes you an hour to do, now that job takes you 2 hours. So there's this other job that you could be doing for an hour doesn't get done. And instead, the consumer has to pay more to have that same exact work done, because instead of having the high schooler get paid whatever to pick up the debris, you've got to pay the guy $18 an hour who could be pruning all day, to pull weeds, to pick up sticks, to pick up the debris from all of that, right? And that same concept extends to the managerial role. If you've got somebody like me who's been doing this for 21 years and knows how to do everything out in the field, but more importantly has business sense and knows how to market a landscaping company, knows how to talk to customers and secure more jobs, that's an incredibly valuable tool. That's somebody you might pay $25 to $30 an hour. In fact, that's somebody you're probably not paying by the hour. That's somebody you're probably putting on salary and giving a great direct and fringe benefits package to. So that person that you're going to have to pay through the nose for, if that person is out laying mulch, or worse, running the wheelbarrows from the truck to the mulch deposit site, if that guy is pulling weeds, you have wasted a colossal amount of money. And on top of all of that, not only as an employer are you wasting that money, the guy who took the $25 an hour to be the manager is kind of demeaned in doing that other work. And on top of all of that, the customer has to pay, instead of $15 an hour, $12 an hour, whatever you would pay some 15-year-old who's never worked before to do this incredibly easy menial work, you're paying the guy who should be in a managerial position, who should be going out and getting you jobs, who should be going out and putting out estimates for major landscaping work, for major landscape architectural work, who should be drawing up plans, who should be doing the business end of things, and is instead of getting you all of those jobs, he's stuck pulling weeds. And what that means, again, for the consumer is that the consumer may not be connected. The potential customer may not be connected to this landscaping company that they would rather have working for them. The existing customer has to pay way more for the exact same labor. So in this case, it is obvious that you would rather have the person performing that labor, not only from the standpoint of the person performing that labor, but from the standpoint of the entire community. And Hazlitt puts this out on page 136. In addition to all of the other things that we've deprived everybody of, he says on 136, we have deprived society of the value of his services. So instead of having those services, he's not there doing it. So instead of, even if somebody else has to fill in that gap, that's other work that they could be doing, that the community could be getting, that the community is not getting. Of course, with all of these hot takes and fiery responses and all of these complaints, Hazlitt doesn't come without solutions. He mentions a ton of them on page 139 as to how to go about raising the wages. And he even talks about, in extremely rare cases, the role of unions on page 135. And just briefly, this is kind of in a response to monopsony. So monopsony is, I'm not going to get into it, but it's been thrown around a lot over the last few months in popular parlance here on YouTube. almost nobody has used it correctly. But when you have a situation where, say, you have a Ford Motor Company, say in 1900, comes to completely and utterly dominate an arena, and you have to work for them because they're the only employer, and it costs way too much money to move out of Dearborn, Michigan, or Detroit, Michigan, to find a city that has some other employer, or they're the only one that's hiring, so you have to go work for them. In this case, what we're talking about is just negotiation leverage. We're talking about something where the employer has, it's a buyer's market for labor, so the employer has just a complete command at the negotiation table over the leverage. So one element you could use to increase your leverage at the negotiation table is by collectivizing that bargaining unit. That would be the role of a union. So Hazlitt actually makes that case in 135. So on page 135. So just to make it clear, Hazlitt isn't axiomatically against labor unions. There is a time and a place, as there is a time and a place for everything, though he does point out that these are quite rare, and I kind of agree with him in this situation, that the role of a labor union really, when you boil it down, is to protect the labor, not to protect the laborer necessarily. And this, by the way, has always been the libertarian take on unions, that they are not necessarily axiomatically bad. I would say that the libertarian take in Hazlitt's take would probably be pretty staunchly against the existence of public sector unions. But again, time, manner, and place. So if you've ever heard the straw man that one side of the political aisle is completely against the existence of labor unions and that they should be illegal altogether, that's not true. It's just that there is a particular role for unions, and Hazlitt points that out on page 135. And it's a fairly rare exemption. Of course, with all of this said, what the response generally you're going to get from the opposition to this position is going to, generally speaking, be just bad faith. He points this out on page 138. It's actually in a footnote, so I don't know if this is going to be in every printed version, because this book was updated a few times over the course of about 25 years after it was reprinted. He points out on page 138 the never-ending raises in minimum wage. So when somebody says 15 now, the response should be, well, why not 15 million now? Why not make minimum wage $15 million an hour? And they're going to look at you straight. Well, that's ridiculous. Yes, it is ridiculous. Now tell me why it's ridiculous. And they won't be able to give you a good response to this, because they know that if they were to push for and get $15 an hour as a minimum wage federally, they know that in a few years that 15 they're going to be pushing for 16 or 17 or 20. So why not just now give us a number that we can stick to, and it will always be the minimum. And that's because they're arguing from a position of bad faith. I've actually wrote an article on thelibertyblock.com about, it was kind of a joke article. So I guess I'll put a link in this video's description to that article on the $15 million minimum wage. The other response you're going to get in summation is the emotional appeal. And we're going to end this review on this excerpt, because the proper response to these emotional appeals we constantly hear about minimum wage is word for word this fire mic drop response that Hazlitt gives on 139. This is perhaps as good a place as any to point out that what distinguishes many reformers, those people in favor of minimum wage, from those who cannot accept their proposals is not their greater philanthropy, but their greater impatience. So well done, Hazlitt. That's one of my favorite reads. We will continue on in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson in our next read in this series on Chapter 20, which, if you guys forgive me because I dropped the book, Chapter 20, Do Unions Really Raise Wages? So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.